So the United States Senate just detonated a political bombshell that Donald Trump's team was completely unprepared for. A resolution blocking Trump's emergency powers cleared the crucial vote threshold, and what left Washington breathless was the fact that at least 12 Republican senators, people once considered the most loyal inner circle, publicly crossed the aisle and voted against him. We're talking about a mass political defection, happening live on the Senate floor within a matter of hours, with the senators giving a simple reason they could no longer keep defending a president who abuses power. Meanwhile, Trump received zero life raft from his own party, and that moment marked a collapse of authority he had never faced since entering politics. Hard to believe, but we are witnessing the most public fracture inside the GOP in years, not backroom rumors but an open rebellion on national television. A source right in Washington described the scene at Mar-a-Lago as total chaos, with Trump screaming at the remaining aides while frantically calling every senator he thought still owed him loyalty. This wasn't just a bad day on Capitol Hill. We are watching a real-time power crisis unfold in real time, where a president who was certain his party would follow him to the end is now forced to confront the fact that they chose to abandon him to save their own careers. And this direct stab will reshape the balance of power in Washington in a way we haven't seen since Watergate. Let me tell you what's really happening, and this is where it gets a lot more interesting. Right after the vote exploded like a cannon inside the Capitol, I started getting a flood of reports from insider reporters in Washington. You know, the kind who live in the hallways of power, the ones who can tell something big is happening the second an office door slams. They told me the reaction behind Republican closed doors wasn't just surprise, it was panic wrapped in fake calm. The list of 12 GOP senators who voted against Trump, yes, that number is accurate, wasn't just the usual suspects. On that list were Marco Rubio, once seen as the party's future star, Roger Wicker, representing a blood-red state, and John Cornyn, one of the longest-serving senators who had stood next to Trump at press conferences countless times as if they were on the same side for life. And when I say those names made Washington's jaw drop, I'm not exaggerating. Because if people like Rubio or Wicker, people who never wanted a public fight with Trump, are willing to stand up and vote against him, then the earthquake inside the GOP is no longer a risk, it's reality. But to really understand the magnitude of this shock, we can't ignore the central figure in this cinematic betrayal drama, Tom Tillis. Tom Tillis of North Carolina. Yes, him wrote a high-minded op-ed in the Washington Post just weeks ago declaring he would vote to block Trump's emergency powers, saying he could not let any president of any party cross constitutional lines. Sounded heroic, right? Then what happened? Tillis went to the White House, met with Trump's advisors, and whatever they said, promised, or threatened, no one knows, but when he walked out, he was practically a different man. A few days later, he took the Senate floor and announced he had received assurances from the president, so he was changing his mind and voting with Trump this time. What assurances? Nobody knows, because nothing was written down. No document, no clause, no commitment, just words in the wind from a White House famous for promising far more than it delivers. And so Tom Tillis, the would-be constitutional warrior, became the perfect poster child for surrender in a suit. When the final list of senators voting against Trump came out, Tillis's name was not on it. No one believes he changed his mind for legislative reasons. No one. Reporters described his floor speech as an awkwardly choreographed confession, where even his voice couldn't hide the reluctance. The reaction inside the GOP at that moment was like watching a theater where the actors forgot the script and started improvising, panic, running around, suspicious glances, everyone wondering whether to follow Tillis or the 12 defectors. An aide to one senator said their office had never seen this many angry calls from constituents, and they weren't from Democrats. They were from Republican voters saying they were sick of sacrificing their state's interests just to protect Trump's ego. The chaos didn't just come from the rebellion, it came from the silence of those afraid to speak the truth. Inside the GOP that day, no one dared predict who would jump ship next, who would flip, or who would pretend loyalty until the last second and then stab Trump in the back once the cameras were rolling. The party was so split that even the staffers didn't know what message to put out: support the president or protect the state, and more people were choosing the second option. Because when your political career is threatened by the very people who vote for you, blind loyalty to the president stops being the smart play. In the first hours after the vote, the phrase every reporter I spoke to used was panic disguised as discipline. They said the GOP had fallen into a state they hadn't seen in decades, not ideological division, not policy arguments, but a collective flight from a leader who could no longer shield them from voter anger. And when the most loyal start turning their backs, that's not normal change. That's the signal of collapse. Then we come to the moment I believe American political history will talk about for a long time. The vote didn't happen behind closed doors, no whispers, no thick wood door deals like usual. Everything, literally everything, was dragged out onto the Senate floor, in front of the entire country, no retreat, no hiding place, and when the presiding officer banged the gavel, you could feel something extremely rare in the Senate: brutal honesty. No one was allowed to vote present. No one could duck into the cloakroom. No one could hide behind vague statements. This was the Congressional Review Act, a tool created precisely for moments like this. It forces every senator to pick yes or no and have their name recorded forever. The CRA was designed to kill shadow politics, and today it performed its function like a thin but razor-sharp legal blade that made an entire presidency bleed power. As the senators lined up one by one at the microphone, with dozens of reporters and cameras catching every tiny movement, the atmosphere felt more like a public trial than a legislative procedure. Some walked up looking tense, others clearly trying to appear calm to hide the fact they were betraying their own party leader. But then, when the 10th, 11th, and 12th Republican names appeared in the yay column, the chamber practically stopped breathing. Not because they said anything dramatic, just because they dared to do it, dared to break from Trump's grip on the biggest stage possible. Each of those votes was a knife in the image of the invincible president Trump had spent years building, and while it was all happening under the bright lights of the Senate, a source told me that back at Mar-a-Lago Trump was like an activated bomb. He was yelling into phones, slamming the table, frantically calling senators he thought had to stay loyal. One advisor said, Trump screamed right in their faces, "How did you let them do this to me?" as if he couldn't comprehend that he himself was the reason they turned. And you know what's almost funny? Those very threatening phone calls actually hardened more offices against him, because they realized that if they kept bowing, their careers would be buried under his endless tantrums. But the real climax of the vote didn't come from Trump. It came right on the Senate floor, when a veteran GOP leader, someone everyone assumed would stay quiet, suddenly erupted. Not a mild criticism, not a polite scolding, real fury, right in front of the cameras. He talked about how his state was being strangled by tariffs, how voters were losing jobs, how he could no longer stand by and watch the president treat Congress like decoration. You can imagine the faces of the MAGA senators at that moment. They sat frozen like deer in headlights. No one dared interrupt, no one dared push back, because in that moment, for the first time since Trump took power, they saw someone willing to say out loud what dozens of others only whispered: Trump has gone too far. I'm not exaggerating when I call this a public execution, a daytime political execution, where Trump's power was stripped bare in front of America. No more illusion of unity, no more unconditional fear. This was mutiny, an open rebellion. This was fracture, a deep crack in the GOP's foundation. And above all, this was a political earthquake whose aftershocks will continue long enough to force the question: does Trump still actually control his own party? What this vote exposed wasn't Trump's weakness in one moment. It exposed the truth that his power had been rotting from the inside for years, and today, under the brightest lights, the shell finally shattered. But to understand why that moment on the Senate floor was powerful enough to nearly blow up the entire power structure that had propped Trump up for years, we have to look deeper, beyond the gavel bangs and the recorded votes. Because this wasn't an isolated event, not a sudden bad day, not a misstep. This was the inevitable consequence of a dam that had been cracking for years, and today, under unbearable pressure, it finally collapsed into a giant crater. The Republican Party has been living inside a pressure cooker ever since Trump entered the White House. For years, loyalty stopped being a strategic choice. It became a forced obligation. A system where senators and representatives had to choose between defending their state's interests or risking a 2 a.m. Trump Twitter attack. Even the mildest criticism could turn a veteran politician into a public target, threatened by extremist groups, or worse, primaried by a MAGA challenger. I've watched this coercion for years, and I know you have too. The sudden U-turns, the reluctant statements, the heads bowed on the Senate floor whenever Trump broke norms or made statements any normal president would be investigated for instantly. And if you want a clear example, go back to 2019, when Trump declared a national emergency to build the wall after Congress refused funding. That year, exactly 12 Republican senators voted against him, saying he had no right to bypass Congress. And remember how Trump reacted. He called them weak, stupid, duped by the left. He threatened them with primary campaigns. He hinted that anyone who opposed him would pay a price. Trump didn't just want their support, he wanted submission. And like any power model built on fear, it has an expiration date. In recent years, we've seen Trump punish anyone who stood up. Jeff Sessions, his earliest supporter, was publicly humiliated for 2 years just for recusing himself from the Mueller probe. Liz Cheney was stripped of leadership for telling the truth about January 6th. Mitt Romney became a non-stop attack target. John McCain, a national hero, was mocked by Trump even after death. All of it was a message to every GOP member: stand with me or I will destroy you. But what happens when that model is used too long? When fear starts suffocating an entire political party? When the people taking the blows for Trump are no longer enough to hold back the flood of anger from their own voters? That's when forced loyalty starts backfiring. And you could see it clearly in every vote that day. Trump's intimidation machine has lost its power. I'm not saying this for drama. It's exactly what GOP senators were whispering to reporters on voting day. Fear doesn't work anymore. When voters in red states are losing jobs because of tariffs, when local businesses are closing, when farmers are going bankrupt, no angry Trump tweet can save their careers. They're no longer afraid of him, they're afraid of their own people. And that's what's truly dangerous for Trump, because once the fear is gone, so is his power. This is structural collapse, not because of a small rebel group, but because the psychological pillar that kept the GOP orbiting Trump has disintegrated. No more awe, no more belief that Trump can protect them, and most importantly, no more obsession that opposing Trump equals political suicide. When cracks build up over years, one day even a small force can bring the whole wall down. But this vote wasn't a small force, it was an earthquake. And we know a political party can survive policy splits, but it rarely survives loss of faith in its own leader. This isn't a plot twist. This is the beginning of a collapse the GOP can no longer hide. And if you want to understand why those cracks inside the GOP suddenly turned into a giant chasm big enough to swallow Trump's entire power structure, you have to look at the one thing every veteran politician fears more than a Trump tweet: the economy back home. Because when the economy in red states starts to crack, when farmers lose entire harvests, when factories lay off workers, when prices at Walmart skyrocket, that's when Republican senators stop listening to Trump. They have no choice but to listen to their voters. And those voters are angry, very angry. Let's start with Iowa, where farmers depend almost entirely on agricultural exports. Trump's tariffs on China were no different than dropping bombs on family farms across the state. Soybeans piled up unsold, corn prices crashed, some farmers had to mortgage their land just to make it through the winter. One farmer told a reporter, "I can't eat loyalty, I need income." And that has been the soundtrack every Republican senator hears when they go home. In Wisconsin, a state that went from red to purple because of constant swings, dairy and meat processing plants have been shutting down because of higher costs, fewer orders, and supply chains wrecked by Trump's driving-through-fog trade policy. Workers in Milwaukee and Green Bay factories told their representatives straight up, "How much longer are you asking us to sacrifice? How many more years?" There was no convincing answer. In Texas, where ports are the economic lifeblood, cargo ships sat idle because tariffs blocked the flow of goods. Oil and gas equipment exporters said outright that they'd lost hundreds of millions in contracts as partners switched to Europe and Canada to avoid America's erratic tariff regime. When Texas senators met with constituents, the message was crystal clear: if you keep letting Trump play tariff games, we'll tax you with our ballots. That's no longer a threat. That's political reality. And what a lot of people forget, but GOP senators never do, is that most of those red states are not wealthy or economically diversified. They live on agriculture, light manufacturing, ports, and local production, the sectors most vulnerable to tariffs. When that foundation wobbles, Voters aren't in the mood to hear Trump talk about his great trade victories, they just look at their wallets and bank accounts, and they're getting emptier by the day. A GOP senator's aide told me their office had to hire temporary staff just to handle the flood of furious emails from small businesses. One factory owner in Ohio wrote, "I voted for Trump twice, but I'm not giving him a third chance to destroy my plant." When people like that, people more loyal to Trump than to the party itself, start talking that way, every Republican senator knows no one is going to save them except themselves. You know, American politics has an unwritten rule: when GOP voters are happy, GOP senators stay loyal. But when GOP voters are furious, every oath of loyalty becomes meaningless. And this rebellion didn't come out of nowhere. It is the direct result of years of accumulated economic pain. The pressure on senators isn't just coming from big corporations, it's coming from truck drivers, farm owners, factory workers, corner store owners, the very people who elected Trump and are now paying the price for his policies. At town halls in Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, voters asked point blank, "Are you more afraid of Trump or of us?" No one dared answer. And you know what that means in politics? It means they've already chosen. At this stage, survival loyalty. They can't gamble their careers just to protect Trump's political ego. One senator told a reporter privately, "We've gone too far. If we don't stop now, our voters will drag us down with him." And that right there is the moment Trump's fear factor stopped working. Not because Trump suddenly got weaker, but because his own voters got stronger in their economic rage. This is the breaking point. This is why the Senate rebelled. This is why 12 senators dared to vote against Trump. This is why that day wasn't an anomaly. It was the completely logical outcome of an economy strangled by tariffs and capriciousness. When the money runs out, the fear runs out too, and when the fear disappears, so does Trump's power. This is the moment we have to say out loud what a lot of people in Washington understand, but few dare to voice. This vote wasn't just political reaction, wasn't just economic outrage, it was the inevitable consequence of a years-long simmering institutional war between Congress, the courts, and a president who has continually tested the boundaries of the U.S. Constitution. To grasp the gravity of this moment, we have to go back to the very foundation of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 8, the clause that gives Congress, not the president, authority over trade, tariffs, and foreign economic policy. The founders did that for a reason. They wanted to prevent any single individual from unilaterally deciding the nation's economic fate based on whim or personal politics. And guess what? Exactly what they feared has happened under Trump. For years, Trump has bypassed Congress by declaring emergency powers as if it were a convenient on-off switch for every problem. Congress won't give permission? Call it an emergency. Don't want to negotiate a budget? Emergency. Want to slap tariffs on hundreds of billions in imports? Emergency. Trump turned emergency into a skeleton key, a tool for the executive branch to overpower the legislative branch. And if no one stopped it, it would become the new governing model, a dangerous model unprecedented since the founding of the Republic. And you know what? Congress isn't the only branch fed up. Federal courts and even the Supreme Court have been flooded with lawsuits over Trump's abuse of emergency statutes. Cases involving immigration, the border wall, tariffs, and countless other policies all revolve around one central question. Does the president have the right to bypass Congress by declaring everything an emergency? And the courts slowly but surely have started saying. One federal judge wrote outright in a ruling, "Emergency cannot be a method for the president to seize powers the Constitution gave to Congress." So when this Senate vote happened, it wasn't just a few senators trying to save their seats. It was a powerful signal from the legislative branch that they've had enough. This is the branch the Constitution tasked with checking power standing up to reclaim what was taken from it. And to me, that's not just politics. That's an institutional moment, an attempt to restore the balance the founders intended. If you look closely, this vote marks the end of what's called the imperial presidency, the modern king model where a president rules by executive order, military resources, and unlimited emergency declarations. That model has been growing for decades, not just under Trump, but Trump took it to a new, dangerous level. Concentrating power in one person is always the recipe for abuse. And when that power is paired with impulsiveness, emotional instability, and vindictiveness toward anyone who questions it, it's not just dangerous, it becomes a direct threat to democracy. America has never had a president who used emergency powers like Trump. No one before him treated emergency as the default strategy to dodge Congress. No one before him turned emergency into a tool to intimidate his own party or to reshape the economy according to personal whim. And certainly no one used emergency to retaliate against countries over personal grudges or campaign talking points. That's why this vote is exactly what it appears to be, a reminder that the Constitution is still alive, still functioning, and still capable of defending itself. Congress, with all its flaws, stood up and said, "No, enough." The courts, slow and cautious, are tightening the legal boundaries. And when both of those branches act together, they send an unmistakable message. America was not designed to be ruled by one man with a signing pen and Fox News-induced rages. This is the lesson every American needs to remember. Power is only safe when it is divided. And today, after years of drifting off course, the system is trying to self-correct. This vote wasn't just against a bad policy, it was against a dangerous model. And if we don't pay attention, don't speak up, don't protect this balance of power, then the next time any president can look at the precedent Trump set and say, "Why can't I do the same?" This isn't a partisan story, this is a story about the Republic. And America just took the first step to save itself. When we look back at everything that happened, the votes, the gavel strikes, the tense faces in the Senate, the angry phone calls from Mar-a-Lago, we can finally say what many were afraid to say out loud: Trump is no longer invincible. The aura of power he has worn for almost a decade, power fed by fear, by threats, by the idea that he could destroy anyone who opposed him, has begun to fade in broad daylight, the moment his most loyal lieutenants stepped out of line. The GOP caucus, locked for years in a cycle of forced loyalty, is now trying to free itself from that orbit, not because they suddenly became Democratic heroes, not because they saw some moral light, but because the system finally reached its breaking point, and the people inside it realized that if they didn't step away now, they would go down with him. But the most important question is, what happens next? Will there be an override vote, an attempt to override Trump's veto in the coming days? Is this the beginning of a wave of new rebellions inside the GOP, where every senator starts recalculating their future without Trump at the center? Will the next votes on immigration, war powers, foreign policy become new battlegrounds where Trump can no longer control the outcome? This is a hinge moment, not just for Trump, not just for the GOP, for the entire Republic. Because the biggest truth in this whole story is when a president loses control of his own party, that's not just news, that's a stress test of democracy. It forces us to look back at everything we accepted over the years: the abuse of emergency powers, the bypassing of Congress, the insults toward judges, the punishment of officials who did their duty, and the normalization of a leadership model based on chaos rather than principle. And when we see 12 Republican senators, people who voted for Trump, defended Trump, feared Trump, stand up and vote against him, it forces us to ask, did they do it because it's right, or because they feared the consequences of not doing it? The real answer doesn't matter as much as the meaning of the moment, because whatever their motive, their actions still punched a hole in the wall of power Trump built, and those holes, as history has shown, never close again. You have to watch. You have to understand. You have to refuse to normalize any abuse of power, no matter who does it. You have to remember that democracy doesn't collapse in a single day. It collapses when we stop caring, stop asking questions, when we decide a president can do anything as long as our side wins. Today we witnessed a moment the founders probably foresaw, a moment when the balance of power has to self-correct to prevent total derailment. And we must remain vigilant, because like every institutional crisis in American history, this one can end either with a stronger democracy or with its destruction. It depends on what we do next. The only thing that is certain, the myth of Trump's invincibility has shattered. And that, no matter what party you belong to, is an opportunity to restore American democracy the way it was designed, not for one man, but for a nation. If you found this analysis helpful, please remember to subscribe so you don't miss any future updates. Thank you for watching, and we'll have a lot more to say next time.